They earned millions entertaining the nation, yet lived in cold flats, walked miles to avoid bus fare, and counted every penny until death. In 1970s Britain, whilst economic gloom gripped the working classes, the entertainment industry was booming. Yet some of its biggest stars, household names who could have bought fleets of Rolls-Royces, chose instead to hoard their fortunes, living in conditions worse than the factory workers who adored them. From comedy legends to rock superstars, these 10 icons took their obsession with money to the grave. This is the authenticated account of Britain's wealthiest misers. Benny Hill. During the 1970s, Benny Hill achieved what few British entertainers had ever managed: genuine global domination. On his comedy program was syndicated to over 140 countries, generating substantial royalties that accumulated in his bank accounts year after year. By the middle of the decade, Hill had become a multimillionaire several times over. The Benny Hill Show was particularly popular in the United States, where it ran on numerous television stations and introduced American audiences to British comedy. Industry estimates suggested his wealth could have easily purchased multiple luxury vehicles, substantial property holdings, and financed a lifestyle of considerable extravagance. His earnings from television, combined with revenue from international distribution rights and merchandise, placed him amongst the wealthiest entertainers in Britain. Yet Hill chose a path that bewildered his colleagues and stunned the press. Despite having financial advisors available to him, Hill maintained personal control over his finances, monitoring every expense with meticulous attention. Whilst his contemporaries in television were displaying their success through exclusive Mayfair Club memberships and French Riviera properties, Hill resided in a modest rented apartment. For decades, he refused to purchase property, viewing such capital expenditure as an unacceptable risk. Visitors to his residence consistently reported shock at the minimal furnishings. The flat contained no expensive artwork, no designer furniture, and no domestic staff. The man who could afford a team of private chefs preferred shopping at local supermarkets, often waiting for reduced price stickers to appear on goods before making purchases. And he approached the bargain section with the dedication of someone whose financial security depended upon it, despite his millions. Hill's approach to transportation became legendary within the entertainment industry. He never owned a motor car. During a decade when luxury vehicles represented the ultimate celebrity status symbol, Hill relied exclusively on his own feet. He would walk several miles from his flat to television studios, not for health benefits, but to avoid taxi or bus fares. On rare occasions when circumstances forced him to take a taxi, documented accounts describe how he would instruct drivers to stop considerable distances from his actual destination if the meter climbed too high, preferring to complete journeys on foot rather than spend additional shillings. And this extreme frugality extended to his wardrobe and personal maintenance. Despite appearing on television screens in millions of homes weekly, Hill wore the same limited collection of casual outfits until they literally disintegrated. Well-documented accounts describe him using strong adhesive to repair shoe soles rather than visiting a cobbler or purchasing replacements. To Hill, buying something new whilst the old items still functioned, however minimally, represented a violation of common sense. He remained haunted by the conviction that his fame represented a temporary bubble that could burst at any moment. When Hill passed away, he left an estate valued at over £7 million, a staggering sum for that era. This represented money he had never touched, never enjoyed, and never shared. He stands as the definitive example of an entertainer who counted every penny until the end. Kenneth Williams. Kenneth Williams' distinctive nasal voice and theatrical expressions made him one of Britain's most recognizable comedy personalities during the 1970s. His appearances in 26 carry-on films, combined with his radio work on programs like Just a Minute and Round the Horn, and his chat show presence, meant he seemed omnipresent throughout the decade. To the public, Williams projected an image of camp excess and theatrical grandeur. His performances were characterized by precise comic timing and an ability to convey both sophistication and absurdity in a single gesture. However, his private life revealed a man governed by financial anxiety approaching obsession. Williams came from modest circumstances in North London, the son of a hairdresser, and these humble origins never left him. Despite his high-profile status as one of the country's most prominent entertainers, Williams lived with extreme austerity, treating every pound note as a rare artifact requiring protection. His income from the Carry-On films alone would have been substantial, but he also earned appearance fees from television chat shows, radio work, and various other engagements that made him one of the busiest performers of his generation. Williams's famous diaries, later published, revealed extraordinary detail regarding his spending habits. Throughout the 1970s, he meticulously tracked not just major purchases, but agonized over the cost of individual cups of coffee. Whilst his contemporaries upgraded to substantial properties, Williams remained in a small rented flat near Regent's Park. He refused property ownership, viewing mortgages and maintenance costs as financial traps, preferring rental arrangements where he could maintain military precision over outgoings. His home was famously Spartan. Williams refused to purchase new furniture if existing items remained functional, regardless of their worn appearance. Visitors were consistently surprised to find that the celebrated star lived in quarters resembling those of an austere schoolmaster rather than a celebrity. He refused to employ cleaning staff, preferring to scrub his own floors to avoid wage expenses. Williams's approach to professional matters proved equally severe. For a significant portion of his career, he acted as his own agent. This decision stemmed not from enjoying negotiation — he famously detested confrontation — but from his inability to accept parting with the standard 10% commission fee. He preferred negotiating lower fees for himself and retaining the entirety rather than securing higher fees and sharing a portion. This mindset often resulted in him being underpaid, but to Williams, saving the commission represented victory. This penny-wise, pound-foolish approach trapped him in lower-paying contracts because immediate savings felt more tangible than long-term gain. Socially, Williams became notorious for avoiding his share of expenses. He loathed the custom of buying drinks rounds and would engineer situations avoiding payment. Numerous anecdotes from Carry-On cast members describe Williams vanishing when bills arrived or meticulously calculating his exact portion down to the halfpenny to avoid subsidizing others' meals. He viewed tipping as unnecessary extravagance and would leave bare minimums, if anything. He preferred inexpensive cafeterias or simple home meals rather than spending money on fine dining. This relentless frugality stemmed from deep dread. Williams remained convinced his career could end instantly, requiring a financial fortress for protection. When he passed away in 1988, he left an estate valued at just over £500,000, a substantial fortune for the time. This represented money accumulated through decades of self-denial. He spent his life preparing for difficulties that never materialized, while leaving behind a bank account full of unspent cash. Rod Stewart. Rod Stewart's raspy voice dominated 1970s charts with global hits, including Maggie May and Sailing. His career trajectory during this decade was remarkable, from his early days with the Faces to his solo superstardom. Stewart became one of the defining voices of the era. Albums like Every Picture Tells a Story and Atlantic Crossing achieved multi-platinum status on both sides of the Atlantic. To the public, he represented the ultimate rock playboy, draped in leopard print, driving yellow Lamborghinis, and dating models. His image was carefully cultivated to suggest unlimited wealth and carefree spending. However, behind this glamorous facade existed financial discipline that would have impressed a Victorian banker. So Stewart wasn't merely careful with money, he was famously tight-fisted, a trait that became a running joke amongst his bandmates and the rock fraternity. His fellow musicians would exchange stories about his reluctance to part with cash, creating a reputation that followed him throughout his career. Despite earning millions from record sales and stadium tours that filled venues across Europe and North America, he treated his wallet with extreme reluctance. One of the most enduring legends regarding Stewart's frugality involves his domestic management practices. Industry whispers suggested he would mark beverage levels in his refrigerator with pen before leaving the house. This ensured that cleaning staff or guests weren't secretly consuming his beverages during his absence. On some occasions, he was accused of refilling expensive bottled water containers with tap water to avoid purchasing replacements, a level of thrift that seemed absurd for a man owning mansions on 2 continents. He viewed these small household consumables not as trivialities, but as assets requiring protection against what he perceived as freeloaders surrounding him. Socially, Stewart developed a reputation for having short arms whenever restaurant bills arrived. Associates from the 1970s recounted numerous instances where the singer would suddenly develop fascination with ceiling fixtures or head to restrooms the moment waiters appeared with checks. If forced to pay, he would scrutinize bills with forensic intensity, challenging every item to ensure he wasn't being overcharged by a single penny. He loathed the rock star tradition of buying drinks rounds for entourages, preferring to let others pick up tabs whilst he enjoyed their generosity. His aversion to parting with cash drove his biggest life decision of the decade: becoming a tax exile. In 1975, facing the Labour government's punitive tax rates reaching 83%, Stewart departed Britain for Los Angeles. Whilst many stars made this move, Stewart was vocal about his refusal to pay what he considered state theft. He uprooted his entire life, not for sunshine, but to protect his bottom line. He famously stated he didn't want to see his hard-earned money wasted, framing his departure as principle, though critics viewed it as ultimate greed. Even his romantic life was governed by strict financial codes. Whilst he showered partners with affection, he was careful not to shower them with too many unmonitored gifts. He was a man who knew the price of everything and the value of keeping it in his own bank account. Stewart proved you could wear flashiest clothes and drive fastest cars, yet still possess a miser's soul, ensuring that whilst champagne flowed, it was usually someone else paying for it. Frankie Howerd. Frankie Howerd's comedic genius was defined by his stuttering delivery, weary expressions, and absolute mastery of double entendre. During the 1970s, Howerd was a national treasure in Britain. His career revival with the hit series Up Pompeii made him one of television's highest-paid entertainers. To the viewing public, he was the lovable, slightly shambolic uncle who poked fun at the establishment with characteristic winks and nods. However, and behind the titter-ye-not, catchphrases, and warm stage persona existed a man consumed by a crippling, almost Dickensian fear of financial ruin. Despite bank accounts overflowing with royalties, appearance fees, and earnings from lucrative summer pantomimes, Howerd lived as if bailiffs were permanently parked at his front gate. He didn't just save money, he guarded it with a level of secrecy and anxiety that became industry legend. Throughout the decade, Howerd cultivated an image of a man constantly down on his luck. In interviews, he would frequently bemoan his financial state, complaining about crippling taxes and high living costs, leading many fans to believe he was struggling. Reality, however, was starkly different. He was a multimillionaire who chose to live in a state of self-imposed austerity. At his home, Wavering Down in Somerset, which he shared with his partner and manager Dennis Hamer, heating was rationed with severity that would have impressed a wartime warden. Guests who stayed weekends often reported that the house was maintained at temperatures requiring them to wear coats indoors, as Howerd viewed central heating as frivolous luxury rather than basic necessity. He would patrol hallways switching off lights and unplugging appliances, convinced the electricity meter was spinning too fast, draining his hard-earned fortune. His wardrobe revealed another area where extreme thrift was visible to all. Whilst other stars of his magnitude visited Savile Row for bespoke suits, Howerd was famously reluctant to spend money on clothes. He would wear jumpers and jackets until they were literally fraying at the seams. I often relying on television show wardrobe departments to provide decent attire for public appearances. Whispers circulated in studios that he would sometimes borrow items from sets, small props, toiletries, or costume pieces to avoid purchasing them himself. When dining out, which was rare, he was a master of the fumble, a tactical delay in finding his wallet that usually resulted in someone else paying the bill. If he did pay, the tip was calculated with mathematical precision designed to leave the absolute minimum required by social convention. This profound inability to enjoy his wealth was rooted in deep-seated insecurities. Howerd had endured a long period in the wilderness before his 1970s comeback, and the memory of those lean years haunted him. He was terrified his popularity was a fluke that could vanish overnight, leaving him destitute. Furthermore, as a closeted gay man in an era where such things were still largely stigmatized, he lived with constant paranoia that he was vulnerable to blackmail. His money was his shield, his protection against a world he found unpredictable. When he passed away, his estate was valued at well over £1 million, a fortune he had spent decades pretending he didn't possess. He left behind a legacy of laughter, but for himself he had created a golden cage of frugality. Arthur Lowe. Arthur Lowe gave Britain the most iconic portrayal of pompous authority in television history. As Captain Mainwaring in Dad's Army, Lowe brought the blustering Home Guard commander to life with such perfection that the line between character and man often seemed to blur. By the mid-1970s, the sitcom was a national institution, attracting audiences of 18 million people. Lowe was arguably the biggest television star in the country, commanding astronomical fees for the era, supplemented by lucrative voiceover work. Yet despite his considerable wealth, Lowe possessed a reputation for tight-fistedness that became legendary amongst fellow cast members. He was a man who played a bank manager on screen, but in real life acted like someone terrified the bank was about to close forever. The most famous accounts of Lowe's reluctance to part with money revolve around social rituals with the cast. The Dad's Army team was close-knit, but Lowe's participation came with a noticeable caveat. Industry whispers widely suggested he suffered from severe short arms and deep pockets. His co-stars, particularly the generous John Le Mesurier, would recount with amused exasperation how Lowe would happily accept drinks bought by others all night long. However, the moment it became his turn to buy a round, Lowe would perform a vanishing act worthy of Houdini. He would suddenly remember an urgent telephone call or check his watch and declare he had an early start, retreating to his hotel room and leaving colleagues to settle the tab. His parsimony extended into professional demands. Lowe was notoriously difficult when negotiating contracts, demanding top-tier expenses whilst refusing to spend a penny of his own money on his comfort whilst working. He treated the BBC accounts department as his personal treasury, battling over minor expense claims with the tenacity of a bulldog. Whilst he eventually purchased a classic steam yacht, the Amazon, as a status symbol, even this luxury was managed with an iron grip. He enjoyed the prestige of the boat, but loathed the running costs, constantly complaining about the price of fuel and crew wages. The psychology behind Lowe's extreme thrift was complex. Unlike some stars who found fame early, Lowe was a late bloomer who had spent decades as a jobbing actor, earning meager wages. When he finally struck gold in his 50s, he couldn't shake the siege mentality of his early years. He lived in constant fear that his success was a temporary glitch and that he would return to obscurity. This anxiety drove him to hoard his earnings, viewing every pound spent as a pound lost forever. He died in 1982, leaving a substantial estate that proved he had indeed counted every penny. Lowe remains a fascinating paradox, a man who became rich playing a character who obsessed over social standing, whilst he himself obsessed over the price of tea. Tommy Cooper. Tommy Cooper's physical presence was as overwhelming as his talent. A 6'4" giant in a red fez who dominated the landscape of British variety during the 1970s, Cooper was the master of the failed magic trick. His seemingly chaotic performances were actually the result of meticulous timing and genius. By the middle of the decade, he was one of the United Kingdom's highest-paid entertainers, commanding appearance fees that would have made a banker blush. He performed at the London Palladium, appeared regularly on television variety shows, and was in constant demand for corporate events and private functions. He was a television staple, a sellout stage attraction, and a man who generated cash as easily as he pulled rabbits out of hats. His television specials consistently achieved high ratings, and his live performances were legendary for their length. Cooper would often perform for hours beyond his scheduled time, seemingly unable to leave the stage. Yet, behind the bumbling persona and the roar of the applause, Cooper possessed a pathological reluctance to spend his own money, elevating the art of stinginess to a level that was almost as famous as his act. The stories of Cooper's interactions with taxi drivers are the stuff of industry folklore, repeated in dressing rooms across the country. He was a frequent user of cabs to ferry him between theaters and various London drinking establishments. But the journey's end was always a moment of dread for drivers. Legend has it that upon arriving at his destination, Cooper would lean forward with a conspiratorial wink, pressing a small folded object into the driver's hand. He would whisper in his signature raspy voice, "Have a drink on me, son." The driver, expecting a generous tip from a national superstar, would wait until Cooper had lumbered away before opening his hand, only to discover that the drink was not a banknote, but a literal tea bag. For Cooper, this was a hilarious gag that saved him a few shillings. For drivers, it was a bewildering encounter with a millionaire who treated a penny like a gold sovereign. His behavior in the pubs and clubs of the West End was equally notorious. Cooper had a prodigious thirst and spent a significant portion of his life in bars. Yet he was famously allergic to the concept of buying around. Witnesses recounted a theatrical performance that occurred whenever the barman shouted, "Last orders." Cooper, who had been happily consuming drinks bought by adoring fans and fellow comics all night, would suddenly develop a fascinating inability to locate his wallet. He would pat his pockets with a look of mock panic, mumbling about leaving his money in his other suit, or simply vanish into the restroom until the danger of paying had passed. It was a well-known hazard of drinking with Cooper. You would enjoy the company of a genius, but you would inevitably pay for the privilege. This extreme parsimony was juxtaposed with a strange habit of hoarding physical cash. Cooper was known to carry large rolls of banknotes on his person, secured with rubber bands. Yet he would practically weep if he had to break into one of them. He lived in a chaotic domestic situation, caught between a wife and a mistress, and perhaps money was the one thing he felt he could control in a life that was spiraling due to his health. He treated cash not as a means of exchange, but as a security blanket to be clutched tight against the world. He died as he lived in the middle of a performance in 1984, leaving behind a legacy of laughter and a small army of taxi drivers who still had a tea bag in their glove compartment, a dry souvenir from the funniest and stingiest magician who ever lived, Charles Hawtrey. Charles Hawtrey's stick-thin frame, round spectacles, and patrician accent made him one of the most distinctive eccentrics in British comedy history. Hawtrey was a cornerstone of the Carry On franchise, an actor who could steal a scene with a single, withering look or camp gesture. By the 1970s, he was a household name, commanding fees that should have secured him a life of absolute comfort and elegance. However, the reality of Hawtrey's existence was a stark, almost Dickensian contrast to his on-screen persona of the posh, oblivious gentleman. And he was a man who possessed a significant fortune, but chose to live in a state of chaotic frugality, treating his money as a score to be kept rather than a resource to be used, eventually becoming a recluse in a seaside town where his refusal to spend arguably cost him his dignity. In his later years, Hawtrey moved to Deal in Kent, purchasing a historic property known as Porter's Lodge. To locals, he was a figure of immense curiosity, a famous star who lived like a pauper. Despite having the funds to renovate the house into a palace, Hawtrey refused to spend money on basic maintenance. He allowed the property to fall into a state of disrepair, with peeling paint and overgrown gardens, simply because he couldn't bear the thought of paying builders or decorators. He famously refused to install central heating, viewing it as an exorbitant and unnecessary expense. Instead, during the bitter coastal winters, he would wear multiple layers of old moth-eaten jumpers and huddle around a small, dangerous paraffin heater, risking his safety to save a few pounds on the gas bill. This extreme thrift created a living environment that was shocking to the few visitors he allowed across the threshold, a dusty, cold monument to his unwillingness to part with his cash. His relationship with the local economy was equally strained. Hawtrey was a familiar sight in the pubs of Deal, but he was the antithesis of the generous celebrity. He would arrive for his daily liquid lunch, often consuming large quantities of gin, but he would scrutinize the change given by bar staff with the intensity of a forensic accountant. Why, he was known to argue over the price of a drink if it had increased by a mere penny since his last visit, creating scenes that were both tragic and comic. He never bought rounds for the locals who stared at him, and he certainly never tipped. On rare occasions, he took a taxi home when his legs were too unsteady to walk. He would haggle with drivers before getting into the car, trying to secure a fixed price lower than the meter rate. If drivers refused, Hawtrey would often attempt to walk, a stubborn refusal to pay full price that demonstrated his chaotic priorities. The tragedy of Hawtrey's greed was that it was rooted in deep, festering resentment. He believed he was a serious dramatic actor who had been trapped in lowbrow comedy, and he felt the world owed him something. He hoarded his money as a form of control in a life where he felt professionally undervalued. When a fire broke out in his home in the 1980s, caused in part by his chaotic living conditions, he was more concerned with rescuing his trousers, where he kept his wallet, than his own physical safety. He famously refused to be taken to hospital until he had secured his valuables. When he died in 1988, he left a substantial estate, money that had sat gathering dust whilst he lived in the cold. He was the ultimate miser of the seaside, a star who died with a full bank account, but an empty life. Ken Dodd. Ken Dodd's wild hair, protruding teeth, and tickling stick made him a figure of pure, chaotic joy for generations of Britons. Dodd was not just a comedian, he was a stamina machine, touring the country relentlessly throughout the 1970s. During this decade, he was indisputably one of the United Kingdom's highest-earning entertainers, selling millions of records and packing theaters night after night. Yet, despite an income that rivaled that of major industrialists, the Squire of Knotty Ash lived a life that was bafflingly disconnected from his immense wealth. Dodd was the ultimate hoarder, a man who didn't trust the banking system or the taxman, preferring to keep his cash close, literally under his bed. Whilst other stars of the 1970s were purchasing sprawling country manors, Dodd continued to live in the same semi-detached Georgian farmhouse in Liverpool where he had been born. He never moved and famously refused to spend money on renovating the property. Visitors described a house frozen in time, filled with decades of accumulated props and unopened fan mail. It was a fortress of solitude where heating was rarely turned on and furnishings were worn threadbare. Dodd saw no reason to replace a chair that still stood. To him, the house was a sanctuary, and spending money on fancy interior design was a vanity he simply didn't understand. His attitude towards travel expenses was legendary. Despite being a multimillionaire, Dodd loathed the idea of spending money on hotels. After a show, no matter where he was in the country, be it London or Glasgow, he would often drive through the night back to Liverpool. He would rather drive for 5 hours at 3 in the morning than pay for a hotel room. On rare occasions when he did stay in a hotel, he was known to negotiate the rate with the tenacity of a market trader, arguing that since he was arriving late and leaving early, and he shouldn't have to pay the full price. The true extent of his hoarding only became public knowledge later, but the habits were formed in the 1970s. Dodd had a deep pathological mistrust of accountants. He preferred cash, bundles of banknotes that he could see, touch, and count. It was an open secret that he often asked to be paid in cash, and this money didn't always find its way to a bank vault. Instead, he stashed it in suitcases and under floorboards in his knotty ash home. He treated his earnings like a squirrel gathering nuts for a winter that lasted a lifetime. He was terrified of losing what he had built, a fear that stemmed from his father's warnings about the fragility of show business. This obsession led to a lifestyle that was almost hermetic. He didn't buy expensive clothes or take lavish holidays. Dodd died in 2018, leaving behind a massive fortune. But his life in the 1970s remains a study of a man who conquered the world of entertainment, but remained a prisoner of his own wallet. Wilfrid Brambell. Wilfrid Brambell became an icon by playing the most famous miser in British television history, only to find that the lines between his character and his reality were uncomfortably blurred. Brambell was the actor behind Albert Steptoe, the dirty old man of the colossal sitcom Steptoe and Son. To the 20 million viewers who tuned in every week during the 1970s, he was the embodiment of grime, greed, and poverty, a rag and bone man who would fight his own son for a pickled onion. However, in real life, Brambell was a dapper, educated man who wore bespoke suits and spoke with a refined accent. And yet, despite the vast fortune that the show's global success brought him, he harbored a financial paranoia that rivaled that of the fictional character he portrayed, living a life of strange contradictions where he counted every penny whilst sitting on a gold mine. By the mid-1970s, Brambell was one of the BBC's highest-paid actors. The immense popularity of Steptoe and Son had led to 2 hit feature films and lucrative tours, filling his bank accounts with royalties. Yet those who worked with him often noted a profound reluctance to enjoy this wealth. He lived in a relatively modest flat in Pimlico, London, which, whilst certainly cleaner than the Steptoe junkyard, was far from the luxurious mansion one would expect for a star of his magnitude. He resisted the trappings of celebrity lifestyle, viewing property investments and lavish cars as dangerous liabilities. His only significant expenditure was on gin, a vice that consumed him. But even here, he was known to hunt for the best prices, treating his addiction with the budgetary strictness of a household manager. His reputation for frugality on set was well known and often a source of friction. Whilst his co-star Harry H. Corbett was known for his generosity and open nature, Brambell was famously withdrawn and protective of his earnings. Whispers circulated in the canteen that he would scrutinize his pay packets with forensic intensity, arguing over minor deductions or expenses that he felt were unjust. He had a deep-seated fear of the tax man, a common phobia in the 1970s, but in Brambell's case, it bordered on obsession. He was terrified that the government would strip him of his security, leaving him as destitute as the character he played. This fear drove him to hoard his cash, keeping his liquidity high and his spending visibly low, creating a fortress of savings that he rarely dipped into for pleasure. Socially, Brambell was a complex figure. He could be charming, but when the bill arrived at a restaurant or bar, the charm often evaporated. He was a master of the slow reach, allowing others to cover the cost of meals and drinks, a habit that alienated many in the industry. He would often complain about the cost of living in London, lamenting the price of theater tickets or taxis to anyone who would listen, despite being in the top 1% of earners in the country. This stinginess was not born of malice, but of a deep, isolating insecurity. As a gay man in an era that was still hostile to his identity and an actor who feared being typecast, money was his only true safety net. He eventually died in 1985, leaving a substantial estate that surprised many who had seen his modest lifestyle. Brambell proved that you can leave the rag and bone yard, but the fear of having nothing never truly leaves you, turning a millionaire actor into a man who guards his wallet as if it were his last possession. Mick Jagger. Mick Jagger's lips and hips defined the 1970s, but his brain was firmly focused on the bottom line. Jagger is known to the world as the charismatic frontman of the Rolling Stones, the ultimate rebel who sang about street-fighting men and sympathy for the devil. However, behind the swagger and velvet jumpsuits existed a mind that possessed the cold, our calculating precision of a seasoned forensic accountant. Whilst his bandmate Keith Richards was living the chaotic life of a rock pirate, unaware of where his money was going, Jagger was busy transforming the band into a ruthless corporate machine. He was the first rock star to realize that the music business was above all a business, and he treated his personal fortune with a level of protectiveness that bordered on the obsessive. The defining moment of Jagger's financial philosophy occurred in 1971, when the band famously fled the United Kingdom to escape the punitive tax rates of the Labour government. This was not merely a lifestyle choice, it was a calculated fiscal evacuation. Jagger uprooted the entire Rolling Stones operation to the south of France, leading to the recording of Exile on Main Street. Whilst this is remembered as an artistic triumph, for Jagger it was primarily a tax-saving strategy. He was determined not to let the government take 93% of his earnings, famously stating that he refused to work for pennies. This move set the tone for the rest of the decade. Every artistic decision was weighed against its financial implication. He became the de facto manager of the group, scrutinizing contracts and tour budgets with a magnifying glass, ensuring that promoters and agents were not skimming the cream off the top. His reputation for personal thrift is legendary within the music industry. Despite earning millions from record-breaking tours in 1972 and 1975, Jagger was known for his reluctance to part with cash in social situations. There are numerous anecdotes from the era describing dinners where the bill would arrive and the wealthiest man at the table would suddenly become invisible. He famously monitored merchandising sales with an eagle eye, knowing exactly how many T-shirts were sold in every city, ensuring that not a single dollar went missing. Even in his romantic life, which was splashed across tabloids, he was known for being careful with gifts, preferring gestures that didn't require significant capital outlay. He applied the logic of the London School of Economics, where he had briefly studied, to the chaotic world of rock and roll. This intense focus on money preservation created a strange duality. On stage, he was the wild, uninhibited performer throwing water over crowds. Backstage, he was the somber executive checking receipts. He viewed the band not just as a musical outfit, but as a brand to be protected and monetized. Whilst many of his peers from the 1970s ended up bankrupt, swindled by managers, or destitute due to their own excesses, Jagger's fortune only grew. He hoarded his wealth by controlling every aspect of his empire, refusing to let sentimentality interfere with profitability. He closes our list as the ultimate example of the financial hawk of rock, a man who seduced the world with his image but kept his wallet firmly snapped shut, proving that in the end, the person who counts the pennies is the one who laughs last. The 1970s in Britain presented a peculiar paradox. Whilst economic difficulties gripped the working classes, with inflation reaching unprecedented levels and industrial strikes becoming commonplace, the entertainment industry generated unprecedented wealth for its stars. Television ownership had become nearly universal, creating massive audiences and corresponding advertising revenues. International syndication opened new markets, particularly in the United States and Commonwealth countries. Record sales reached historic highs as the LP format matured, and live performances commanded increasingly substantial ticket prices. Yet, as we've documented, some of Britain's most beloved entertainers, Benny Hill, Kenneth Williams, Rod Stewart, Frankie Howerd, Arthur Lowe, Tommy Cooper, Charles Hawtrey, Ken Dodd, Wilfrid Brambell, and Mick Jagger, chose to hoard their fortunes rather than enjoy them. Whether driven by fears of financial ruin stemming from memories of pre-fame poverty, concerns about the sustainability of their success in a notoriously unstable industry, memories of harder times when work was scarce and payment uncertain, or simply pathological frugality that may have had psychological roots in their upbringings. These 10 icons lived lives of contradiction, public faces of success masking private lives of extreme penny pinching. They entertained millions, brought laughter and joy to households across the nation and beyond, yet never learned to laugh at their own anxieties about money. Their relationships with wealth reveal much about the psychology of success and the persistent fears that can survive even the most substantial financial security. Each died wealthy, their estates proving that their careful hoarding had been successful in purely monetary terms, yet demonstrating that in the end, you cannot take it with you, but that didn't stop them from trying to save every last penny until their final breath. Their stories serve as cautionary tales about the relationship between wealth and happiness, reminding us that financial security and the ability to enjoy that security are two entirely different things.